Alright, so week 5 of class, which is week 2 of Photoshop lessons and raster lessons. There's 3 different semi-related things that we're going to be going over. The first is image restoration and sort of repairing damages or erasing things, stuff like that. But the first thing I want to do is actually talk about a little bit more about raster stuff in general so that we can understand how these image restoration tools are working. So I have one of my images that I was working with last week, and one of the things I mentioned in some of the other assignments is that we don't want images to be too big. They make the file size to be too big, so we need to sometimes reduce the size. And the way we would do that is we would go to image size. And there's a lot of numbers here, and yours may default to inches instead of pixels, depending on the version of Photoshop you're in and the type of file you're working on. But this is an image I got from Flickr, and it actually looks like I've already resized it a little bit. But its overall size is 1500 pixels by 1125. Now, that is sort of its absolute size, right? X number of pixels by Y number of pixels. And in the digital world, we measure things really in pixels because that's the actual, I hate to say physical size of the image, but that's how it is. Anything other than that, all these points, inches, centimeters, all these things, these are, if you were to take it out of the digital realm and put it on paper, how big would it be? And that's determined not only by how many pixels you have, but how many pixels per inch you're dealing with. So right now the resolution is 72 pixels per inch. That's a standard web resolution. So when you're online and if you have anything, there's really nothing here, something like this, this banner right here, this is an image, I think. Yeah, so that image is displaying at 72 pixels per inch. Now, of course, you can always make stuff bigger, but you'll see when I do that, it makes it fuzzy, right? So this isn't like Illustrator, it's like Photoshop. It's rasterized already. But 72 pixels per inch is the standard DPI for the web. You can go a little bit higher in some browsers, but usually we don't. If you want to print this image and have it not look crummy, can't do 72 pixels per inch. Right now, if I move this to inches, at 72 pixels per inch, it thinks this image is 20 inches by 15 inches. It's not. I already know 1500 pixels off the top of my head is not going to be 20 inches of proper printing. I just know that from working with these numbers a lot. So how do I make this so that it could print? Well, we need to change the resolution. Meaning not the actual dimensions, but how many pixels per inch they're going to be. And 300 is usually the standard size. But what's happened here? Well, I did that, and it stayed at 20 inches per 15 inches, but the dimensions are now 6200 by 4800 pixels. And if I hit OK, this is the wrong way to do it. You don't want to do this. What it's doing is it's adding a lot of pixels, right? So now this is 67% and here's 100%. But you can see that there's a lot of pixelation going on here. This isn't fuzziness from the camera. This is like a breakdown of the image. Let me find a better spot maybe. There we go. So you can see individual it's a little fuzzy. It's fuzzier than usual, but this is not a clear picture, right? This picture is clear somewhere around here. And that's because that was sort of fake resolution added. I've always said that you can't make things bigger, and technically you can add pixels, but it's not adding anything that's clear, right? This is how big this image is as it was taken by the camera, or at least as it was uploaded to Flickr and then I took it from them, right? This is as clear as it gets. You could add pixels all the live long day. You're not going to get any more detail. You're not going to get any more sharpness. This is exactly what it's going to look like. You can always make it smaller. Smaller is easier. Bigger, next to impossible without it looking fuzzy and terrible. So if I go back to image size, I just hit undo, by the way, to get rid of that. So if I go back to the resolution here, the image size, I need to make it so that I'm telling it to redistribute this exact number of pixels across a new number of inches at 300 pixels per inch. And what I'm going to do then is turn off resample. And if I turn off resample, you'll see that this little chain connects to all three. Before it was just height and width. This is called Constrain Proportions, and what it means is that if I change one of these numbers, you see both numbers change. And that's a good thing because, I'm going to hit cancel, because that way you don't have to sit there and do the math and figure out just how many pixels you need to change one to match the other so that it stays the same size. So constraining proportion is always nice. You can turn it off. I don't know why you would. When you turn off resample, it also constrains the resolution to these things. So now when I turn the resolution from 72 to 300, you see the number of inches went down. This is a good thing, right? That's how big that photograph is. You're only going to print it at 5 by 4, which isn't even a real photo size. That's like smaller than usual. But that's all you're getting out of this, right? If you do anything less than 300 pixels per inch and you send it off to like a printer somewhere, it's not going to look good, right? So I did that, and you'll see it still says 100%, and that's what I'm looking at. Because all I did was change the print parameters, really. I didn't change the image itself. The image is still the exact same number of pixels. It's just going to print differently. If I go to File, Print now, it's going to, see, teeny tiny. That's all you're getting. I mean, you can do this. It'll look terrible. Excuse me. So, that's general raster information, print size, pixels. You need to think in terms of pixels. We didn't in Illustrator because vector-based artwork can be resized so easily. We more thought in terms of inches, like the final product. But in this case, we need to be thinking about pixels from the beginning. Also, by the way, if for some reason you download an image, maybe switch back to, here we go, pixels. If you download an image and it's huge and you're like, whoops, I don't need it to be 1500, I need it to be 1000, you would just click that there, hit OK, and it'll shrink the image a little bit. For the purposes of this class, your images don't need to be huge. I don't want them to be this size, that's too small, but they don't need to be, you know, double page spread of a newspaper sized. The bigger they are, the larger the file size, so keep that in mind. The other thing you might have to do when saving is have different versions of the same file. So first off, I'm going to do a save as to rename this because this is a dumb name. So we're just going to call this cat dramatic. All right. So I've got my dramatic cat here, and he's a PSD file. So I can, you know, have different layers and all these kinds of crazy changes. But let's say you're sending something to a client. Not me, I want PSD files. But if you're sending something to a random client, what, you know, how are you going to send this? They don't have Photoshop, they can't open a PSD. Also, the file is probably relatively large. So we can do File, Save As. And instead of cat dramatic PSD, you see under here it says Save As Type. I'm going to select JPEG. Not JPEG 2000, not JPEG Stereo, those are different things. Just JPEG. And I say save. And you can set the quality as high as you want. I usually have it thrown up to 12. JPEGs are highly compressed, so it's going to be a smaller file size. And if I go to downloads, name. This is called Cat Dramatic. So I have two different files. One's a PSD, one's a JPEG. The PSD is 3.7 megs, which is actually not that big because that file was not that big. Cat Dramatic, the JPEG, is 530 kilobytes and is perfectly viewable without Photoshop, right? This, Windows can't read it, most people's computers can't read it. A JPEG, literally everything can look at a JPEG. So when you're sending stuff out to people, you need to flatten it. The other reason to flatten things is if you are working for a client and you hand them your file with, this is kind of a bad example because there's not a lot going on here. There we go. And you hand them a file with like all these different layers and all the work in it, and it's full size, right? It's the big version of it. And you hand them this before they've paid you. There's nothing keeping them from like paying. Like they have everything they need. Now, most people are honest, but you need to protect yourself. So, whenever you are sending things to a client, you should make it smaller. You should flatten it so they can't make any changes really without going back to you. And if you're dealing with someone who's like really shifty, you may even want to put like a watermark over it. So, and then when they pay you is when you give them the final version. So again, file, save as, and instead of a PSD, you make it a JPEG just so they can look at it. And hit save, and it's gonna save it as a new file. That's not what's open though. This is a PSD that's open. All right. So keep that in mind as you're working. You're gonna have to keep track of different file types, different saves for the same thing. That's very common in this line of work.